Hi, this is G from Native Speakers Academy, and this is our Introduction to English Grammar Maps, part of our Secret Keys to English series. Those people who don't know the school may like a little bit of information about what we do. We're a small private school that provides alternatives to traditional forms of education, and we're based in Banská Bystrica in the center of Slovakia. We teach and train teachers and design special language courses for individuals and small groups. If you have been following our video series, then you will know that normally we do videos on elements of education and society. But today we're going to look at a very special element of language. And we have called this area English Grammar Maps. So what are maps? Well, maps might also be referred to as grammar charts or tables or diagrams. And these are a visual method that the Native Speakers Academy has developed over the last few years to help students and teachers memorize and understand the basic systems of grammar in the English language. The aim here is to present a supplementary method for teaching grammar. And it is supplementary because it can be used in parallel with any classic course or as a revision technique in special courses. As we go through this information, which should take around about 45 minutes. It might go a little bit longer, we'll see. We've got 44 slides, I think, to go through. And I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible for you. But I'd also like to add in a little bit more information here and there and try to give you a few extra examples to clarify any information that's presented in these slides. So please think about the information as we go through from two perspectives. Excuse me. How does this affect me as a teacher? Think about it from that perspective, and how can I use this to support my work? You may wish also to ask how this information can be useful to my students. And later on in the presentation, I will give you some practical classroom examples and techniques to show how you can implement this information into your curriculums. So if everything goes okay, you should be looking at the first slide, which is the introductory slide. You should see written at the top, Native Speakers Academy, Secret Keys to English series, English Grammar Maps, and right in the center you'll find a picture. And I want you to keep this picture in your mind as we go through the information, and hopefully we will be able to untangle some of the confusion that exists surrounding tenses in the English language. You will also note a quote at the bottom. Everything is connected to everything. Leonardo da Vinci. Which is something, again, to think about when we're teaching in any school, that very often a lot of the subjects across curricular and what happens in one classroom can very often affect what happens in other classrooms as well. Also, how can we isolate teaching points when the whole area of language and grammar is so connected? Can we even do that? If we move on to our next slide, then what you will see is some background information. So just to fill you in on where all of this information is coming from, I was asked in 2011 by two organizations to give a presentation to EFL teachers on an aspect of the English language. The vastness of a language being quite a broad spectrum to cover, I decided to share some insights into how we could better visualize grammatical perspectives as they are taught to students. The inspiration for this was simply that when I presented this information to my students, they were for the first time able to create a mental map to self-navigate through common methodological problems. Further research led me to realize that the recognition of this need was not a new phenomenon, and further details about this I shall present to you in the next slide. Yet, despite this clear and present recognition of a need for further visual stimulus, there were and still are very few examples of constructive language models that educators had or even have access to. Following the presentations of these verb map systems, I put the information on a shelf and ignored it. Since then, I have added to these ideas through my own teaching style and have extended the ideas of planning a route through the English language to several other grammatical areas. However, here I leave you with the basic slides of the original presentation, which still has room for improvement, in the hope that you may find them of some use. And it's important to realize that I think this project still has room for improvement. So perhaps you can take it and make it your own. Perhaps you can take it and add a little bit of information to it. Or maybe you even want to take something out of it. It's really up to you how you see it. Related to the background information, you should be able to see slide background information number 2. You will see there some quotes from Scott Thornbury and Jim Scrivener. Now, these will hopefully not be new names to you. They're quite well known in the English language teaching field. Scott Thornbury has a really nice presentation entitled 7 Ways of Looking at Grammar. I really recommend that you take a listen to that if you can find it online. Anyway, he breaks down the English language into 7 grammatical areas. This is how we view grammar in the language. He has grammar as rules, grammar as structures, grammar as mathematics, grammar as collocation, grammar as texture, grammar as a... what does it say? Grammar as algorithms, I believe, and grammar as an emergent phenomenon. Now, the information that you will hear about today fits into the areas of grammar as structures, grammar as mathematics, and maybe grammar as rules as well. I'm looking at the language from that perspective. We're trying to build a map, so we're trying to give some structure to the way that we look at language and the way that we present language to students. So on the slide, Scott Thornbury writes, in Uncovering Grammar, grammar is a system of rules or patterns, that's on page 1, and grammar is a map of the language, which we find on page 2. Jim Scrivener writes, in Learning Teaching, at lower levels, students seem to find patterns more user-friendly than grammatical terms. That's on page 207, and there is no point in studying lexical terms if they are not remembered. That's on page 239. Moving on, you should now be able to see the presentation plan. This is what we're going to go through today. So we'll go through an introduction. This is the introduction. Then there are tables and charts equals nothing new. This is where I would like to show you that you already understand a lot about this subject, but you probably just don't think about it very much. Part 3 is understanding learning. This is the relationship of the theory to the practical. You can look at the work of Jim Scrivener on the process of development and memory for more details about this. Next is problems and solutions. A brief look at the complex web network of integrated problems and solutions that exist when teaching a language. Part 5, what are grammar maps, which is basically the same as asking the question what is a map or what does a map do. Part 6, the 4 verb systems. These are the main visual ideas designed to help and develop understanding, where we break the tense systems down. We then have an application of mapping. This is where we will go through practical examples of how to integrate these ideas into the classroom. Then we have section 8, background structures. These are other considerations to have when using different structures and presenting different areas of the language. And finally, questions and answers, which we are probably not able to do in a presentation like this, but I will leave my contact information at the end, and if you have anything that you wish to ask about this presentation, then please feel free to send me an email, or you can just type in Native Speakers Academy into the internet. You'll find 2 major websites that we have: NSA-Slovakia.com. We also have NSA-Education.com. We're also on Facebook and YouTube and Pinterest and LinkedIn and lots of other sites as well. So I really hope you won't have a problem finding us. Let's dive in. You should now be looking at the 5th slide, which is a substitution table. Well, why is this table important? It really is an explanation of how grammar is a system of rules or patterns which describe the formation of a language's sentences. And that comes from page 1 of Scott Thornbury's Uncovering Grammar. If you remember the quote, grammar is a map of the language, then I always thought it was quite interesting how none of the grammar books actually contain any maps. Although grammar itself is described as a map, there are no maps in those books. And this is one of the elements that led me to search for patterns within the language. And you can see here in the simple substitution table that charts like these are nothing new. I'm sure you've seen this one before. The style exists in lots of student books. It shows a clear separation of information. First at the top is a simple table where you select the information that you need. A second table requires a little bit more creativity from the part of the students, where they need to import or input some information into the table. So a substitution table, which we often find in lower levels of student books for elementary and pre-intermediate students. In addition to substitution tables, you should now be able to see the 6th slide, which is a syntax chart. This is another simple method with just words and arrows, which I've often used with beginners. We don't really consider it a classical map, but it is mapping out the words and their relationships. It's informing us about their use and meanings. It is interesting because we can take this information in many directions. I personally have used it with lower levels to introduce pronoun concepts and adverbs. You can see in the table that the arrow shows the relationships between the words in the sentence. So it introduces types of words and their interrelationships. Moving on from this, you should now be looking at the slide Understanding Learning and the Need for Maps. Here we add a touch of theory. This introduces one of the most commonly accepted procedures for language development in a learner. This is taken from Jim Scrivener's Learning Teaching, and you can see here the processes that a learner should be going through when they meet new language, try to retain it and then use it. The first stage, of course, is meeting, where students get exposed through reading and listening and maybe conversation. Following that, we have recognition, where the students begin to notice specific items in use in the language. Then we have practice, with understanding the form and use and trying things out in a safe environment. Following that, we have the application. In a semi-real environment, students should be able to communicate in different contexts, and this process manifests itself through reading, speaking and writing. Finally, there is auto memory, also called long-term recall or living resource or auto response. Students remember and perhaps can contribute to the learning of other students. Now, what is quite clear to me in this process is that something is missing. There is something which needs to connect all of the parts together. And this is the fact that information must go into the mind, be stored, and be recalled at each stage. And this is where maps come into play. For a moment, consider what any student has to learn in any school or in any part of life. One of the greatest keys to learning is memory and recall. But how often do we teach students methods to remember? Or how often are they empowered with the skill of using their own mind as a library? Back to Jim Scrivener's Learning Teaching on page 239, he says, there is no point in studying new lexical terms if they are not remembered. Wise words, perhaps even slightly obvious, but maps can help us with memory recall. I know that personally, before going somewhere on a journey, I will take a look at a map and I will try to memorize where the places are and try to store that map in my mind so that I know where I'm going. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to create a map, and hopefully we're going to be able to create this together as we go through. I am also reminded at this point of David Spencer's presentation, Recycling Language. David works for Macmillan and has done a lot of presentations, but in this specific one he pointed out that we live in a culture of use once and throw away, where we very often don't have to store information in our minds as much as we had to in the past. It is in fact the natural tragedy of life that we do actually forget more than we remember. So we need to focus on the mental skill of remembering and do what we can to help students with that. Moving on to slide number 8. You should be able to see problems versus solutions, with common problems that teachers have in the classroom on the left and possible solutions, not perfect solutions, just possible solutions on the right. Now consider these as not directly related to each other but all interrelated, something like spiders' webs on top of spiders' webs. Let's go through them as quickly as we can. So, common problems. The order of taught verbs is illogical and requires abstract thought processes. What this means is that the order of structures is often not logically presented. Whether it is systematic or not in courses can be argued. But this is a puzzle that teachers and students are left to try to put together themselves. And if it doesn't happen automatically, then often it does not happen at all. Consider a book teaching one tense on page 12, another on page 21, and another on page 33. Taught weeks apart, maybe after a holiday, or on a Friday afternoon. Maps can help us avoid these problems. Next, course books have different methodologies and styles. Students often change courses, change books, change teachers, change schools, have problems with the method, have issues with the teacher, are using old books. Well, maps are there to assist you with these issues. Next, students and teachers need a reference point that they can always return to. We need a firm foundation, something that will not change, a solid base of information on which we can build something that can smooth the transition between courses. Maps can do this. Following on, students bring different abilities, experiences, emotions, and histories into the classroom. So we have differing levels of students, some capable who pick up things fast and who do everything and more, and others whose attention tends to drift towards the window and out to infinity and beyond. Maps allow a variation in speeds of study. Teachers are under pressure to produce assessment results. Among the thousands of problems teachers have to deal with daily, there are tests which often become the focus of the course. The end point is the focus rather than the transfer of information into the long-term memory. Consider the amount of students who are not able to recall information about what they studied for the exam just after the exam. So here maps can ease the process of knowledge gain or knowledge retention, and so would be helpful. Next, most curriculums have an external design and do not take into account individual needs. Somebody who sits in a towering office miles away cannot, no matter how much scientific data is produced, design one course that works for everyone. In 5,000 years we haven't been able to create one, so we need supplements, and maps are just one more example of this. Again, not the only example, but every little bit helps for sure. Now, if we look at the other side of the slide, we have possible solutions. Maps produce anchors in the mind and are permanent reference points. As already pointed out, we need to be able to store information in patterns and be able to recall it. So, when we get into the slides, please note positions, colors, images, links, comparison, and repetition. All of these are extremely important. Next, they, meaning maps, are visual stepping stones across the pond of language. We need to take positive gradual steps through a methodological process. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So these are stepping stones in the mind. Imagine an image, try to see it in your mind, try to hold it there, and then later hopefully you'll be able to find it in the same place. Remember that memory most often uses visual references. Next, they can be used and applied with any regular course. Maps and tables and charts and diagrams can be handed out to students, stuck on walls or doors or fridges or the back of chairs, or even just casually slipped into the back pages of a book, perhaps for curious self-discovery, if you have students that are that way inclined. They can be referred to at any point in time for any reason, especially in preparation for tests. I am sure that you have heard of the phrase that every picture can tell a story, or an image is worth 1,000 words. This is a fundamental principle of all maps. And also now infographics, which are growing in popularity because of the ease at which they can transfer information to people. Next, no answer is absolute, as we all learn in different ways, and all learning comes from the learner. For sure, we are all different. I know that no two people that I have ever met have been the same. We need to stimulate the learner, but we cannot solve every problem ourselves. We need to incorporate a variety of methods. Finally, we live in an increasingly connected world which we cannot ignore. Each student now has the world at their fingertips, from YouTube to Facebook to internet networking, to blogs, to forums, to virtual world chat rooms. We cannot deny the face of education must keep up to date or be all too soon left behind. That's why we need to inject new ideas into our teaching. So we move from problems and solutions to what are grammar maps. Said simply, grammar maps are a way to understand where you are and plan where you want to go, so that you can go where you want. Learn about your language environment, so you develop an understanding of the structure of the grammatical world. Find your way back to where you were, or retrace your steps, so that you never get lost. There are a way to relate the grammar world to the real world, to see how the language grows and develops and is structured, and to see that it's not random, though some students might make you wonder about this from time to time. It's also a way to equate the grammar world to mind maps. In a business context, mind maps and structured thinking are very popular at the moment, and there are indirect links between the subjects, so you can also try them with business people. Just as a note, if you ask me, mind maps are simply just an extension of brainstorming, but that's subjects for another day. Finally, they can eliminate common problems, because education is a journey, not a destination. The procedure is at least as important as the place. You have to be where you are, understand what you're using, otherwise you will miss out on the important pieces of information. Yeah, it's an old Buddhist philosophy. Be where you are, otherwise you will miss most of your life. Now, we can get into the basic verb map. We can start to get our teeth into the subject here. So let's delve into our maps, starting at the shallow end, but we will slowly get into deeper water. You should be able to see the 4 basic verb groups in the basic verb map, color-coded and numbered as well. So the first structure that most students encounter is System 1. System 1 is, of course, the verb be. Now, the verb be seems to be a very simple place to start, but you need to begin at the beginning. You should be able now to see the Verb Be Table. Again, this is probably not new to anyone following this presentation, but still we need to start with a familiar reference point. So perhaps this is visually stimulating to students, then again perhaps not. The aim is to show form, order and structure. Now as you look at it, you can probably fill it in with your mind. If you have students, they could do it together. They could do it looking at the present first, then the past, and then the future, which is the methodical way to do it. You could do it before a presentation to see how much students know. You could do it after a presentation to see how much students are able to recall. Or you could simply just present it as a puzzle to the students. You should be able now to see the completed table with all the information that is filled in there. As I stated already, I would look at it with the present forms first, then the past forms, and then the future structures. You can see at the bottom that the past and the present have the same structure. However, with the future form, students are introduced to the concept of two verbs together. Do not underestimate the importance of this, as here students will be maybe for the first time meeting two verbs together, and this is learning that will prepare them for elements to come in other areas of grammar, in the continuous, in the perfect, in the modal, and in the passive forms. You may wish also to integrate teaching points here, such as when using two verbs together, you make the first verb a negative if you have negatives. It's really up to the teacher to introduce the information when they feel it is the right time. But these structures and principles are going to repeat again and again in the students' learning of language. So the map that you're laying down there in their mind is extremely important, because they will be able to use it again to help them with their language development. So you should now be able to see the basic verb map system again, the four systems. First system that we just looked at was the system with the verb be. Now we have normal full verbs, system 2. These of course get subdivided into regular and irregular, sometimes just called normal verbs, sometimes just called full verbs. So it's important to recognize the different processes that will be at work in the student's mind as they encounter this information. So what can we see? The normal full verb system 2 usually introduces simple forms first, usually introducing the present and then the past and then the future. That's the order that I would introduce them. For lower students, we need to highlight the auxiliary included in the negative and question forms of the present and the past. That's why they're in bold in the table there. We can also at this point compare what is happening between the knowledge that we've presented already in System 1 and what we're overlaying now with System 2. We can see that the and this is what I should also say, this is what the students will be doing in their mind, either consciously or subconsciously. This is what they need to do to be able to use the right forms. We can see the future is the same, so there should never be any problems. Of course, that's in a perfect world. We can see that a student using the present and past will need to correct themselves by using the correct system. They'll need to be able to select the correct system. And this is where I ask unsure students to make a conscious choice between System 1 and System 2 in their mind. It's quite an important question. Are you using a form of the verb be, or is it a full normal verb? Now, of course, if you're looking at older teenage learners or adult learners, this is probably a conscious process they will have to go through. If they have spent time in an English-speaking country, they might have developed a subconscious understanding of the language. We now need to be aware that there might be a conflict in the student's mind between the conscious thought about information and the subconscious information. We really need to make students conscious of the language that they're using at this point, because doing this gives students the information they need to be able to develop their own language skills here. So that's a comparative of System 1 and System 2 grammar. If we return to System 2, we add in the continuous activity verb form. Again, introducing the present, then the past, and then the future. A question you might like to think about is, why does it take around 2.5 years to go from teaching present continuous in a general language class at a high school in a country that does not have English as a first language? Why does it take over 2 years to go from teaching present continuous to future continuous? In most courses, that is. Is it really so complicated? Are we not just following a mathematical formula here, where if you are able to understand the present and you are able to understand the past, then the application of will plus be plus the verb plus ing into the future is really not a big step? Here, we are also asking students to define the difference between the simple and continuous forms. That's between facts and habits and activities. This can be a choice, a perspective of the student in the past and the future, but it's not so simple in the present, where facts just use the simple form and the present action uses the continuous form. We must also here consider the concepts of two events happening at the same time, or one event in the middle of another. These principles we're not really going to cover here. They're much better represented by timeline diagrams, and we of course are limited by our time. Moving on, you will be able to add the next piece of information into the table, which is the perfect simple forms. Again, present followed by past followed by the future, in that order. Structurally, we can see some simple logic going on. Grammatically, the word perfect of course means before, not wonderful or fantastic. I'm sure you know that. Perfect is not concerned with the activity. It's not concerned with the activity, but with the unfinished time period in which it occurred. It describes an event before the present, or before the past, or before the future. There. And then completing the table, we add in the perfect continuous form. These tenses only usually enter syllabuses and courses at higher levels. It's a more complex structure, but it does follow a logical pattern. And we have the fact or habit activity question that we need to answer. I personally have given this information to students at different times, sometimes before studying the tenses, getting them to puzzle it out for themselves, especially where I felt they were competent enough to perhaps progress by themselves, or where it just complemented the learning process. Then there's the possibility also to give it to them later, helping with revision, and we can also highlight tenses that are grouped together for specific reasons in the table. Highlighting tenses that are grouped together. So, to take an example of this, a classic example would be the basic narrative tenses, the story tenses. These, of course, are what we need to use when we're telling a story. We can see what the target is in the mind. We're looking for the past simple, the past continuous, or the past perfect. We need to be thinking in the highlighted area, in the highlighted region. We need to be able to visualize these specific time elements and structures in my mind. And I would probably use this in conjunction with timelines. But again, it's up to each teacher to find their own way of presenting the information. We can do the same thing highlighting basic future forms. In addition to the classic be going to an infinitive, not included here, we can see another group that students need to be aware of. This could be used again with intermediate students. It really depends what group you have. I've used it with lower levels. You can also highlight the reasons for the use of each of the grammatical forms. Lower level students will probably not need this information because they can use just will in its practical sense as a default form. There are always other ways to do this and introduce the information, but you want a solid system for reference. You want something you can always go back to that's not going to change. So as one of my friends said, you don't want to make it like an Easter egg hunt. You don't want to be looking for things when you don't know where they are, as very often some course books do. So hopefully the map can help anchor this information into our mind. We now return to our basic verb map chart, where we add in the third group, which is system 3 and is modal verbs. Let's have a look at basic modal structure. Modal verbs, in my opinion, are essentially a huge mess in most, though not all, course books, with a few experts even arguing about the form and use of some verbs. So let's try and see if we can map it out or untangle this mess. It's also important to note at a higher level we enter into emotive and emotional language. We'll try to avoid that here and just keep it simple. This information here really deals with everything a student needs to know for the Cambridge FCE exam, for example. This is the B2 level in the Common European Framework. So you should be able to see the table of basic modal structure. These are the main modals down the left side, within a system presented for remembering them. You see the 3 M's, may, might, must, the 3 ouds, could, would, should, the ought to next to the should, as they have the same principal idea or concept. These visualizations are hopefully little anchors in the mind. Also, with the basic modal concepts, you can see there are symbols added. You could use pictures. Symbols were just easier to create in this presentation. You can see an example of structure there. You can also see that this is not a new structure, where the verb is just followed by an infinitive, and it's not a new structure the way we developed the negative and the question also. So we're mapping over information that we've previously introduced to the students. If we go deeper into this subject and look at how we divide these verbs into ability, advice, obligation, permission, and possibility, then we get to see some more of the differences appearing at this level in this area. One of the differences we really notice between modal concepts and full normal verbs is that the full normal verbs have a past, a present, and a future, whereas the modal verbs only have a present and a past. The present is the future. It's contextual. You have to look at the principal idea in the conversation, and from that perhaps an adverb phrase of time included there. From that you then get an idea of if we're discussing present time or future time. So what we have here is a chart for the modal verbs, or system 3 in the verb map. Usually we begin with ability, and I would go through the chart presenting all present forms before presenting all past forms, as do most course books, because it can be very confusing. But then I leave it to the discretion of the individual teacher. You got to do, or you have to do, what works best for you. I should add here, there are a few grammatical curve balls, to use a baseball analogy, in this area. Maybe you'll spot them as we work through this together. So we've added in there the modal for ability in the present, the modal for ability in the past. We've also added in there a normal structure using be able to and infinitive that can be used in the present and the past. It's also important to understand what's happening in the student's head at this point. And so we can make a comparison between System 1 and System 3 grammar. So in the table System 1 versus System 3, what you can see is that the principal structures for the present are the same, but the future and the past are different. So we can see what we can map on top of, and we can see what the student has to add in to their knowledge through the table. Returning to the chart of modals, we can now add in information about possibility. Note the highlighted modals. They're highlighted because they are unusual opposites of strong possibility. Unusual opposites, where the grammar does not follow a logical pattern. So it helps to highlight this for the students. Again, I would repeat, I'd look at all the present forms before looking at the past forms, but for ease of presentation, there are the present forms, and you can see the past structures underneath there. After looking at possibility, I would continue to advice, where students have very few problems with the present forms. It's the expression of a good or bad idea. Note the irregular structure and form of ought to. And note that in the past, a positive sentence means the activity is not done, which is slightly illogical but not uncommon in language. We then continue beyond advice into obligation. This gets slightly more complex with the addition of normal structures, need to and infinitive, and have to and infinitive there, together with the modal form. And we see that there's a transition into the past where the modal does not form a modal past, it forms a full normal verb structure. So Again, perhaps it's an illogical process that we're asking the students to think through here, but when we map it out, we can at least show them in the table and give them a visual reference. The final element of the table is permission, where we're talking about asking an authority before we do something. It's pretty clear in the present, but is a bit more confusing in the past. It's perhaps best looked at from the perspective of reported speech, where it can becomes could and may becomes might. A few different textbooks present different opinions on this. Try to find practical examples and present them to your students. You could also go into other details and elements here. Perhaps you may even like to add would into the present permission forms. You have to find something that works for you with your understanding of the language. And where you meet new information, you have to adapt it as well. So we see here that students are asked to process these different concepts in their mind, where a full normal verb would have just one, maybe two meanings, but just one regularly. We can see that a student looking at studying modals is going to have to realize that the words all have different concepts which change depending upon our language needs. We can see could in the present for possibility, in the past for ability, and both in the present and past for permission there. And it is quite complex to understand this without a table or without a map, to map out the language and to separate the ideas, especially in a course book. Unfortunately, it actually gets a little bit more complex. We can move on to look at complex modals of obligation here. Now, this is a really difficult area for some students, and even a few teachers trip up on it as well. But it's important at the B2 Common European Framework level because it appears in, or usually appears in exams or can be tested. Students can be tested on it there. So let's look at this carefully. These are complex models of obligation. We've got past, present, and future. Across the top, we've got have to as a full normal verb. We've got need to also as a full normal verb. We've got then must as a modal, and then need appearing as a modal as well. Most students learn to cope with must, but need is quite unusual, perhaps even quite illogical, but the table provides a map that students can anchor into their mind and focus on it. Hopefully, there's much more that we could go into about the relationships of have to with need to, about the relationships of must with need as modals. You can see from the bottom of the table, need as a modal verb is a really specialized piece of language. It needs to be looked at individually, and you really need to walk your students through that very carefully. But again, we don't have time to go into the comparisons of areas and meanings too much here. You can see that I've added in there where there's choice, where there's no choice, and that's something I try to point out to students to help anchor the ideas into their mind. So we've gone through 3 systems already. System 1, the verb be, System 2, full normal verbs, System 3, the modal verbs, and System 4, the auxiliary verbs. Well, we haven't actually done that. We're going to go into that right now, which is the last part. Students should have a pretty good grip on the concept of auxiliaries or helping verbs, especially after their progress through other structures. I really don't think it needs to be taught so much, but it could be highlighted in terms of revision. So we need really to just review and compare what students already know at this point. One important question that the student needs to be thinking about and the teacher needs to be considering is, how do we recognize an auxiliary verb? Well, simply we can see from the table that where there are two verbs, the first verb is acting as an auxiliary, giving auxiliary or helping information. You see the examples in the table where it says I am Slovak, am being a full verb, I am playing the piano, am carrying the modal concept, and play carrying the meaning of the verb through the sentence there. Also examples for do and examples for have are in that table. I do everything, the full verb, I don't do everything. Do highlighted again as an auxiliary. I have a car, have as a full verb. I have been to Paris, have highlighted as an auxiliary, the first of the two verbs. You might also want to note at the bottom that be is also an auxiliary verb in passives. The book was read by everybody. And that have is also an auxiliary verb in have got, as in he has got a car, which is the same principle, meaning as he has a car. Now we could go really, really deep into that area of language, but we don't have time in this presentation. If we return to look at our verb systems, you can now see a layout of the different things that we need to know in the different areas, the 4 areas of the verbs. The verb be in system 1, we need to know the past was were, the present am is are, the future will be. In normal full verb system 2, we need to realize that there are regular and irregular verbs there, and we need to be able to develop the concepts through the past, present and future in the simple, continuous, perfect simple and perfect continuous. Then with the modal verbs, sometimes called modal auxiliary verbs, system 3, we have may, must and might, could, would, should, ought to and can. Remember, these are color coded and highlighted in a way that students can remember them. And then at the top we have our auxiliary helping verbs, which is the 4th and last system there. So how do auxiliary verbs compare with full normal verbs in a verb map table? Well, here's an example. You can see that putting the map together, we can begin to understand the relationships between the different areas of the grammar map. We can also compare structure and formation in the different areas, and we can see how the building blocks of the language begin to fit together. And how does the verb be compare with modal verbs? Here we are putting together a more complex sections of our map, and you can see how the language grows. You can also see that on the slide I've basically run out of space to show how it grows completely, which can't be helped in this situation. If you have a board with a pen, you can squeeze in a little bit more information sometimes, but you can't really do that here. You might also notice that I've added in a tiny little piece of information to the language of modals. It's in the language of possibility, and it's the fact that quite illogically has appears as an option to use there in place of must in some situations. There are many exceptions to rules, as you know, in the English language. We just have to deal with it as best we can and introduce it wherever we feel it's necessary. So those are the maps that we have. How does this fit into a practical application of mapping? Or how can we check and review these ideas in a classroom? Well, let's begin with Jim Scrivener's resource, Learning Teaching. If you check out page 265, it reads, we have defined 3 methods of introducing students to grammar. And through his book, he defines the 3 methods as teacher explanation, guided discovery, and self-directed discovery. You need to get into his book for more information about that. That's not what this presentation is about. Teachers really also need to take note of the excellent section on comments, instructions, and questions through guided discovery. I think that's around page 270 in his book, Learning Teaching. It's really invaluable, especially for the student teacher. And what this all does is it all feeds into conversation. And one way of developing the conversational element in an application of mapping is through mirror grammar. This is the basic concept that a question is giving you the answer already. In other words, once you have met the structure and it has been introduced or taught, when you are given a question, you are essentially given everything you need to respond with a grammatically correct answer. And you can see the system here that's presented as teacher-student, student-teacher, and finally student-student. It really depends how you set up your classroom, how you organize it, whether as a teacher you like to dominate the introduction of information, or you like to help the students to try to discover some of the answers by themselves. The point about mirror grammar, or the important point, is that it stops what I call box jumping or system jumping. This would be an example of this would be a teacher presents a question in the present perfect form and a student gives the answer in the past simple. That would be box jumping. You're jumping from one box on our map, on our grammar table, to another box, which is really illogical in the method of communication in which we should be using correct grammar. That if the question is presented in the present perfect, the answer should be in the positive or negative form of present perfect, provided of course the question is a grammatically correct question for what the student wishes to communicate about. So this might be nothing really new, but it's an example of something that actually works. It's tried and tested in the classroom. We can add to this another little bit of information that the system can help you to recognize, pinpoint, and then correct problems such as wrong tense, wrong form, or even mixed form. Or even where there's a collision between System 1 and System 2 grammar in the mind of the student. Now what we really need to focus on, because I've given you lots of maps backed up with the theoretical principles, we really need to look at how we can hammer this home in a classroom teaching setting. And to do this, we need to look at some practical methods about how we can apply this in the classroom. So you should be able to see the information and application of mapping part 2. Practical methods for use in the classroom. Let's go through them together. Number 1, slip empty tables into the back of a student book and complete them as you go through a course. Quite simple, a nice addition to courses that already exist that don't use such methods. Number 2, place larger tense maps on the classroom wall for reference purposes. Point them out when you need to. Students can refer to them when they need to. Organize the students into groups and get them to debate about how to complete the tables. Get them to share information with each other. Students teaching students where possible. Number 4, use the tables as revision notes before an exam. Just as a quick reference, the students can study them to help clear their mind on certain areas of grammar and issues. Number 5, use in conjunction with timelines as a secondary visual reference. So I use timelines in my school. I find them very helpful, and I find that when you join timelines together with grammar maps, you really do create nice anchors in the mind for the students. Number 6, complete the tables, maps and charts together with individual students to check their understanding and overall knowledge from previously studied courses. So if the students are coming into your class, you don't know how much they know, you can use the maps and the tables to check this information. Number 7, test through teacher-student-teacher mirror grammar techniques where the teacher introduces the structure and the student is encouraged to initiate a response that is positive or negative. I've already explained a little bit about this. Number 8, play question and answer games such as yes, no, I don't know, to highlight different structures in small groups. One student is selected. This is how it works. One student is selected. They sit in front of the rest of the class. The class will ask questions using different grammatical structures. The student must give an answer. The student is not allowed to say yes, no, or I don't know in any of the answers. If you find that too simple, you can make it more complex. Sometimes I add in no repetition. They can't repeat exactly the same answer twice, and they have to answer each question. They can't avoid a question. Of course, you want to make sure that the questions are not too personal as well, but usually the personal questions are how you catch out the person sitting in front of the class, how you make them say yes, no, or I don't know. Moving on. Number 9, play grammar map bingo using positive, negative, and questions, or even with active and passive forms. Bingo can be adapted in endless ways to be used in the classroom. Number 10, use as a reference method to smooth the differences between course books with different methodologies and different structure orders. So if you've got students coming into your class from other different classes, you can try to smooth the transition by using maps to see how much they know, by getting them to work with each other to share the different information that they already have. Number 11, give out for self-study or home learning as a challenge to more advanced students. Give it to them, tell them to take it away and bring it back filled in. That's all you have to do. Number 12, give to slower students to memorize as homework. Perhaps they will, perhaps they won't. It's really up to them. And number 13, used with student teachers whole maps to highlight the different thought processes and structures required for forming correct language patterns in verbs for all 4 systems. The question is, are we really aware what we're asking students to do when we're asking them to speak a language? We need to help them as much as possible and give them as much information that can be as helpful as possible. So we've mapped out the tenses. but there are other areas that can be mapped. We don't need to limit this just to tenses. We're limited here by time, and so we can't go into all of the other areas, but there are many areas of language that can be mapped out. You can see that I've added into this table other areas that I've already tried to do this in, with word order, question words and structures, phrases of quantity, spelling rules, relative pronouns and clauses, word formation, active versus passive, using numbers and letters, conjunctions and adverbials, adjectives, comparatives, superlatives, conditionals, verb structures, wishes and hypotheticals, ways to tell the time, related prepositions, future forms, adverbs with present perfect, possessives, third person, so and such structures, ed and ing adjectives, forms of like, reported speech, the language of habit and used to forms, giving advice, and narrative tenses can all be mapped out. You can also explore those areas by yourself. Then in addition, we have essential background structures that can also be mapped out. This is really important for your lower level students who are struggling in areas of language, and students who are really beginners. If they're not able to fix these ideas in their mind, then they're not going to be able to effectively produce the right language. And so the essential background structures, showing how the subject relates through the verb to the object, introducing the reflexive pronoun, the possessive adjective and the possessive pronoun, is a table which can really clear up a lot of information for students, because very often it's not presented in a clear way in books. Students are just left to try to puzzle it out for themselves, or it just puts more pressure on the teacher to have to help the individual students with their personal language problems. And as we know, being a student in the classroom, time is limited. So the background structures are just an example of something simple that I use with elementary students. It's a compact little collection of essential information that I often stick in the back of their book. So now it's time to review what we've gone through. We went through an introduction to the topic. We asked if this was really something new for us. We found ways to build on things which we already know. We went through the process of understanding what learning is and the processes students need to go through of understanding some problems and some solutions, how grammar maps could help. We went through the basics of what are grammar maps. We looked at the 4 verb systems in the color charts and maps. We looked at applications of mapping, how to practically apply the information in a classroom setting. We gave a few examples of background structures that students really need to know. Otherwise, if they don't have the basic information, they won't be able to build on anything there. So this is where our little journey has taken us. If you have any questions you would like to ask about grammar maps, if you'd like more information, if you want to extend the idea, if you've got ways about how to make this better, then I would love to hear from you. It would be great to get an email, or as I said earlier in the presentation, you can contact us through Facebook or Pinterest or YouTube or LinkedIn. Remember that the Native Speakers Academy websites are NSA-Slovakia, and nsa-education.com. You can find a lot of other ideas related to education and philosophies of education on our websites. How you apply the information is really up to you. I will be happy if I hear that someone else has been able to use it in a positive way in their classroom. The final slide, which you can see, hopefully untangles the lines that you saw in the first picture at the beginning. You will also see contact details and website information there. Well, that's almost it. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Remember that it's a work in progress, so feel free to take it, change it, and make it your own. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope that this has been in some way helpful for you. Hopefully speak to you soon. Take care.